This is the story of Daniel Cross, a man who believed only in numbers, profit margins, and cold calculations until one October afternoon when 10-year-old Sophie changed everything with 5 simple words. It's behind that wall. What started as a routine building inspection became an excavation of buried secrets, hidden crimes, and the kind of courage that doesn't depend on age or status. Because sometimes the truth isn't just hidden, it's entombed. And sometimes it takes the innocent eyes of a child to see what adults have chosen to ignore. This is a story about walls. The ones we build, the ones we break down, and the ones that, when shattered, reveal everything we thought we knew was a lie. Are you ready to discover what was behind that wall? Daniel Cross had built his reputation on demolition, not just of buildings, but of anything that stood between him and profit. At 34, he was the youngest real estate tycoon in the city, known for his surgical precision in turning forgotten neighborhoods into gleaming developments. His colleagues called him the Ice King, and Daniel wore that title like armor. The October wind cut through downtown as Daniel's black sedan pulled up to the Meridian Building, a relic from the 1960s that had served as his company's secondary office for decades. Tomorrow, the wrecking ball would reduce it to rubble, making way for another luxury complex. Just another number in his portfolio. Final walk through Mr. Cross. His assistant had noted in the calendar. 45 minutes, then demo crew arrives at dawn. Daniel stepped from the car, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the cracked sidewalk. The building loomed before him, its windows like empty eyes staring down at the street where children played, and elderly residents sat on stoops watching their world prepare to disappear. He'd done this walk dozens of times before. Check for remaining assets, verify utilities, disconnection document, any last-minute concerns for legal. It was mathematical, clean, emotionless. But as Daniel approached the entrance, something was different. A small figure sat on the building's front steps. A girl of perhaps 10 years old with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed far too serious for her age. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice carrying its usual crisp authority. "This building is closed to the public." The little girl looked up at him with an expression that made Daniel pause. There was no fear in her gaze, no childish defiance. Instead, she studied him with the kind of careful attention that reminded him unsettlingly of his own business demeanor. "I know," she said simply. "I live next door. I'm Sophie." Daniel glanced toward the adjacent brownstone, a building he'd somehow never really noticed, despite months of planning. "Well, Sophie, this area isn't safe. The building is being demolished tomorrow." Sophie nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer. Then she stood, brushing dust from her jeans, and said the words that would crack the foundation of everything Daniel thought he knew. "Don't go yet. It's behind that wall." Daniel almost laughed. Children and their games, their imaginary treasures and secret hideouts. What's behind what wall? But Sophie's expression remained deadly serious. "The one they built after someone got hurt. Mr. Whitaker knows about it. He's been waiting for someone to ask." The October air suddenly felt colder. Mr. Whitaker had been the building's security guard for 27 years. Daniel found him in the lobby, a silver-haired man in his 60s, whose gentle eyes held the weight of decades spent watching over this place. When Sophie appeared beside Daniel, Whitaker's face registered something between relief and resignation. "She told you about the wall," Whitaker said. It wasn't a question. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. What wall exactly? Whitaker glanced around the empty lobby, its marble floors echoing their hushed voices. "Third floor, East Wing," Been sealed up since 1998. I was here that night when they built it. Built it? Daniel's business mind immediately began calculating. Unauthorized construction potential code violations, insurance implications. Who authorized construction in 1998? That's the thing, Mr. Cross. Whitaker's voice dropped even lower, carrying the weight of a burden he'd carried alone for 25 years. Nobody authorized it. It happened after the accident. 3 men came in the middle of the night with concrete mix and tools and fear in their eyes. They showed me paperwork that looked official enough, work orders and building permits and signatures I recognized. Told me it was emergency structural repair, said the whole building could be unsafe if they didn't shore up that section immediately. Sophie stepped closer to Daniel, her small hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of support that surprised him with its warmth. Mr. Whitaker never lies, she said simply. He's the one who taught me that buildings have stories just like people do. And sometimes those stories need to be told. Daniel looked at this child who seemed to understand things about truth and courage that he'd forgotten somewhere along his climb to success. What kind of accident, Mr. Whitaker? The old guard's eyes grew distant, focusing on memories he'd tried to bury for decades. Construction accident? Scaffolding collapse? September 15th, 1998? I remember the date because it was my wife's birthday, and I was supposed to leave early to take her to dinner. Instead, I spent the night watching them build a wall where there used to be a doorway. Was anyone hurt in this accident? Daniel asked, though something in Whitaker's expression told him he already knew the answer would be difficult to hear. Jimmy Martinez. Whitaker said, his voice barely audible. Good man, hard worker, had a family waiting for him to come home. The scaffolding gave way during the late shift. Safety inspector had already gone home. Supervisor was handling an emergency on another floor. Jimmy fell 3 stories onto concrete. The lobby fell silent except for the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of city traffic. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. A recognition that this story was going to complicate everything he thought he knew about his business, his success, his carefully constructed life. What happened to his family? Sophie asked quietly. Did they get help? Whitaker's expression darkened. That's where things got complicated, little one. The family kept calling, kept asking questions. Mrs. Martinez Maria. She came here almost every day for months looking for answers about what had happened to her husband. But the company said they had no record of Jimmy Martinez ever working here. Daniel felt the ground shift again more violently this time. No record. How is that possible if he was killed on company property? Because by the time the investigation started, all the paperwork had disappeared, Whitaker explained. Employment records, safety reports, witness statements. Everything that proved Jimmy Martinez had ever existed in relation to this company just vanished. Like he'd never been here at all. Sophie's young voice cut through the adult's growing tension with laser precision. But you were here. You saw what happened. Why didn't you tell someone? Whitaker's shoulders sagged under the weight of 25 years of guilt. I was scared, Sophie. Scared of losing my job, scared of getting involved in something bigger than I understood. I had my own family to think about, my own bills to pay. And the people who cleaned up the mess, they made it clear that asking questions could be dangerous for everyone involved. What people? Daniel asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Company executives, Whitaker replied. People with authority and resources and the kind of connections that could make problems disappear. They told me the investigation would be handled internally, that the family would be taken care of, that discretion was in everyone's best interest. Daniel's mind was racing through implications and possibilities, trying to reconcile this story with everything he knew about Cross Development's history. He'd purchased the company in 2010 from Harold Hale, a man who'd seemed desperate to sell despite the business's potential. Had seemed almost relieved to walk away from something he'd built over decades. "Show me the wall," Daniel said finally. They rode the elevator to the third floor in heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts about truth and consequences and the price of keeping secrets. When the doors opened, Daniel immediately noticed that this floor felt different from the rest of the building, colder somehow, despite identical heating systems. More oppressive, as if the air itself carried the weight of hidden guilt. Whitaker led them down a hallway lined with empty offices, their open doors revealing spaces that had once buzzed with activity, but now stood as monuments to abandonment. At the end of the hall, where the corridor should have continued, stood a wall that looked newer than the surrounding structure. "Here," Sophie said, pointing to the section of wall with the confidence of someone who'd studied this mystery for a long time. "You can see where the paint is different, and the concrete underneath, it's not the same as the rest of the building." Daniel ran his hand along the surface, his trained eye immediately recognizing the inconsistencies Sophie had noticed. The paint was indeed a different shade applied over what seemed to be hastily smoothed concrete. The craftsmanship was poor, rough, and uneven in ways that suggested urgency rather than professional installation. "This is definitely newer construction." Daniel confirmed his business instincts kicking in despite his emotional confusion. But why would anyone seal up a corridor? What was back there? "That's what I've been wondering for 25 years, Whitaker admitted. "The night they built this wall, I saw them carrying boxes and files and equipment into that section. Hours of work like they were relocating an entire office. But by morning, it was like that space had never existed." Sophie pressed her ear to the wall with the kind of focused concentration that reminded Daniel of a doctor listening to a heartbeat. "The sounds are quieter during the day," she reported. "But at night, especially when it's windy, you can hear things moving around back there." Before Daniel could respond, footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them, sharp, determined clicks that announced someone's approach with military precision. "Mr. Cross." A familiar voice called out, tinged with surprise and something else, anxiety perhaps, or fear. They turned to see Vanessa Hale striding down the hallway, her designer heels clicking against the worn linoleum with the kind of authority Daniel had always admired in his most trusted executive. At 35, Vanessa was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly reliable qualities that had made her indispensable to Cross Development's success. "Vanessa," Daniel said, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease at seeing her familiar face. "I was just conducting a final inspection before tomorrow's demolition." But Vanessa's eyes weren't on Daniel. They were fixed on the wall with an intensity that made the hair on Daniel's neck stand on end. In her normally composed expression, he saw something he'd never witnessed before. In 8 years of working together, raw, undisguised fear. "You shouldn't be up here," Vanessa said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. This section was condemned for structural instability. The engineering report specifically recommended against allowing anyone in this area. Sophie looked between the adults with the kind of sharp intelligence that missed nothing. "But Mr. Whitaker comes up here every week for his security rounds. He's never mentioned any structural problems." Vanessa's gaze snapped to Sophie with an intensity that made Daniel step protectively closer to the child. There was something in his trusted executive's expression that he'd never seen before, something cold and calculating that reminded him uncomfortably of his own pre-Sophie approach to obstacles that needed to be eliminated. "Who is this child?" Vanessa asked her professional mask, slipping to reveal something harder underneath. This is Sophie. Daniel explained his protective instincts, surprising him with their strength. She lives next door and was concerned about some sounds she's been hearing from this section of the building. She shouldn't be in here at all, Vanessa said with finality. Mr. Cross, I really think we should clear the building immediately. The demolition crew needs to prep the site tonight, and having civilians present creates unnecessary liability issues. But Daniel was studying the wall again, noticing details his trained eye had initially missed. Near the baseboard, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a hairline crack that seemed to run the length of the sealed section. And was it his imagination, or could he actually hear something from behind the concrete, a faint scratching that might have been settling or might have been something else entirely? Vanessa. Daniel said slowly, his voice carrying a new authority that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with moral obligation. What do you know about construction work done in this building in 1998? For just a moment, less than a second really, Vanessa's professional composure cracked entirely. In that brief window, Daniel saw panic calculation and something that looked disturbingly like guilt. Nothing, Vanessa replied too quickly. Why would I know anything about construction from 1998? I wasn't even with the company then. It was true Vanessa had joined Cross Development in 2016, 2 years after Daniel's acquisition, but her response felt wrong somehow, like an answer she'd prepared for a question she'd been hoping no one would ask. Maybe we should postpone the demolition, Daniel said the words, surprising him even as he spoke them. Just for a few days until I can research the building's complete modification history. That would be extremely expensive, Vanessa said. Her voice regaining its professional edge but unable to hide an underlying desperation. The crew is scheduled, permits are in place, and we have buyers waiting for site preparation to begin. Besides, what could possibly be behind an old sealed doorway that would justify that kind of delay and expense? Sophie looked up at Daniel with those serious, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything adults tried to hide. Then she spoke with the kind of quiet conviction that cut through all the adult complexity and fear, the truth. The word hung in the hallway air like a challenge loaded with implications none of them wanted to fully examine. Daniel found himself looking at this remarkable little girl and feeling something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening like ice beginning to thaw after a long, cold winter. He thought about Maria Martinez somewhere in the world, having spent 25 years not knowing what had really happened to her husband. He thought about Jimmy Martinez falling from scaffolding while his family waited for him to come home. He thought about the kind of man he'd become, someone who could purchase a company without ever questioning why the previous owner had been so eager to sell. And he thought about Sophie, who had noticed what adults had chosen to ignore, who had cared enough to speak up despite being just a child, who believed that truth should matter more than convenience. I'll make some calls. Daniel decided, his voice carrying a strength that felt new and authentic. Have the demolition crew stand down until Monday. I want complete records of all modifications made to this building over the past 30 years. Vanessa's face went pale. Daniel, that's really not. It's my decision, Daniel said firmly. Then looking at Sophie, he added something that surprised them all. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. As they prepared to leave the 3rd floor, Daniel noticed that Sophie was hanging back, her small fingers tracing the crack in the wall with peculiar concentration. When she caught him watching, she whispered something that sent ice through his veins. It's getting louder. Daniel couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m. he found himself driving back to the Meridian building, his mind churning with questions that had no logical answers. The street was empty except for a few scattered cars, and the orange glow of streetlights cutting through the October darkness. He expected to find the building dark and silent. Instead, he saw a small figure sitting on the front steps. Sophie looked up as he parked her breath, forming small clouds in the frigid air. There was no surprise in her expression, as if she'd been expecting him to return, or perhaps as if she'd never really left. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, his protective instincts immediately overriding any other concerns. "Sophie, it's the middle of the night. It's freezing out here." "I couldn't sleep either," Sophie said simply. "The sounds got louder around midnight. I was afraid they'd stop before someone could hear them." Daniel felt that familiar chill run down his spine. Sophie buildings make lots of sounds. Settling heating systems, pipes. "It's not pipes," Sophie interrupted with the kind of certainty that only children possess. "It's someone trying to get out." Before Daniel could respond, another figure emerged from the shadows. Mr. Whitaker approached them with a heavy flashlight in his hand and an expression Daniel had never seen before, determined, almost fierce. "You came back," Whitaker said. "Good. I've been thinking about that wall all day and I realized something. I should have done this 25 years ago." "Done what?" Daniel asked. Whitaker reached into his jacket and pulled out a sledgehammer. "Broken it down." The weight of the moment settled over them like a physical presence. Here they were, a powerful CEO, an elderly security guard, and a 10-year-old girl standing in the darkness at 2 a.m. preparing to destroy a wall that someone had very deliberately constructed to hide something important enough to kill for. "Wait," Daniel said, his legal training finally kicking in over his growing emotional investment in the truth. "If we're going to do this, we need to be careful. Document everything, preserve any evidence we find. Make sure we're not inadvertently destroying something that could be crucial later." Sophie pulled out her phone, a simple model that Daniel realized was probably more for emergencies than entertainment. "I can record everything," she offered. "My mom taught me how to use the video function in case I ever needed to document something important." It struck Daniel that this little girl had been raised by someone who understood that children sometimes needed to bear witness to adult failures. That documentation could be a form of protection in a world where powerful people preferred inconvenient truths to remain hidden. "Some things are more important than procedures, Mr. Cross." Sophie continued, her young voice carrying wisdom that most adults never achieved. "My grandmother always says that the right time to do the right thing is right now." Daniel looked at this remarkable child, then at Whitaker with his sledgehammer and his 25 years of guilty silence, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what leadership actually meant. It wasn't about managing quarterly profits or optimizing development timelines. It was about having the courage to break down walls that should never have been built in the first place. "All right," Daniel said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Let's find out what they were so afraid of us discovering." They entered the building together, Whitaker's flashlight creating a pool of illumination that seemed to push back more than just physical darkness. The elevator carried them to the third floor in creaking silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts about truth and consequences and the price of courage. When they reached the sealed wall, Sophie immediately pressed her ear against the concrete with the focused attention of someone who had made this examination many times before. "It's louder tonight," she reported, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "More insistent, like whatever's back there knows we're here." Daniel put his own ear to the wall, half expecting to hear nothing but his own imagination amplified by suggestion and circumstances. Instead, he detected something that made his breath catch in his throat, a faint but unmistakably rhythmic tapping. Not random like thermal expansion or settling foundations. Deliberate, patterned, almost like it's Morse code. Daniel whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Whitaker handed him the sledgehammer with the solemnity of someone passing along a sacred responsibility. I'd been waiting 25 years for someone with the authority to do what I should have done that first night. The first blow sent shockwaves through Daniel's arms and sent a chunk of concrete crashing to the floor with a sound that echoed through the empty building like a gunshot. As dust settled in their flashlight beams, they could see that the wall was indeed newer construction, maybe 6 inches of hastily poured concrete over what appeared to be a wooden frame. It's not structural. Daniel realized, his professional eye immediately recognizing the difference between load-bearing construction and quick concealment. This was designed to hide something temporarily, not to permanently alter the building's integrity. 3 more powerful blows opened a hole large enough for their flashlight beam to penetrate the space beyond. What they saw on the other side made Daniel's blood run cold and his heart race with equal intensity. It was a small room, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, that had been completely sealed, except for the opening they'd just created. The space was filled with cardboard boxes, file cabinets, construction equipment, and what appeared to be photographic materials scattered across improvised work tables. But it was the smell that hit them first, when air began to circulate between the spaces, not decay or death, as Daniel's worst fears had suggested, but something else entirely. Paper and metal and chemicals and the musty scent of secrets that had been locked away too long in artificial darkness. It's like a hidden office, Whitaker said, his voice filled with wonder and dawning understanding. They sealed up an entire workspace. Sophie was already working to widen the opening, her small hands clearing away loose concrete with determined efficiency. There are papers everywhere, she called back. And photographs, and filing cabinets with the drawers pulled open. Hakituum. Daniel and Whitaker worked together to create an opening large enough for them to enter safely. Inside, their flashlight beams revealed a room that looked like it had been abandoned in desperate haste. Papers scattered across tables, photographs tacked to walls with pushpins, and in the center of it all, a metal filing cabinet, with its contents spilling onto the floor in organized chaos. This is documentation. Daniel realized, his business mind immediately recognizing the signs of a comprehensive record-keeping operation. Someone was collecting evidence about something important enough to hide an entire investigation. Sophie was kneeling beside one of the scattered boxes, holding a black and white photograph up to their flashlight beam. "Is this your building, Daniel?" Daniel took the photograph and immediately recognized the Meridian building's exterior, but different from how he'd ever seen it. Scaffolding covered the entire east face. Workers in hard hats were visible on multiple levels, and construction equipment filled what was now a small neighborhood park. The image was professionally taken and date-stamped in white block letters, September 14, 1998. "That's the renovation project," Whitaker said quietly, his voice heavy with memory and growing understanding. "The one that was supposed to modernize the building's facade and improve structural integrity. The one where—" He stopped abruptly, his face going pale in the artificial light. "Where what Mr. Whitaker?" Sophie asked with the directness that Daniel was learning to associate with her approach to uncomfortable truths. "Where Jimmy Martinez died," Whitaker whispered. The silence that followed seemed to contain the weight of 25 years' worth of unanswered questions. Daniel had never heard that name before, had no record of any worker fatality associated with cross-development properties. But here in this sealed room were dozens of documents bearing his company's letterhead, insurance forms, medical reports, and what appeared to be a complete photographic documentation of a scaffolding collapse. Sophie had moved to another collection of materials and was holding up a manila folder thick enough to contain months of correspondence. "There are letters here," she said, her young voice filled with a sadness that seemed far too mature for someone her age. "From a family asking about someone who never came home from work." Daniel's hands trembled as he took the folder from Sophie's small grasp. Inside were photocopies of letters written in careful Spanish and heavily accented English, all addressed to cross-development, and all asking the same desperate questions. What had happened to Jimmy Martinez? Where were his final paychecks? Why wouldn't anyone return phone calls or acknowledge that he had ever worked for the company? The letters were from Maria Martinez, and they told a story that made Daniel's chest tighten with recognition of injustice and institutional cruelty. Maria writing to ask about her husband, who had failed to return from his construction job. Maria requesting information about insurance benefits or worker compensation claims. Maria begging for acknowledgement that Jimmy Martinez had existed, that his life had mattered, that his death deserved explanation, and his family deserved answers. And paper-clipped to the back of the folder was a company memo typed on cross-development letterhead, dated September 16, 1998, and signed by someone Daniel didn't recognize, stating definitively that Jimmy Martinez was not an employee of cross-development, had never been contracted to work on company properties, and that the company had no record of his employment or any workplace incident involving anyone by that name. The memo was dated one day after the scaffolding collapse that had killed Jimmy Martinez. Someone erased him. Daniel said, his voice hollow with the realization of what he was holding. Someone made a deliberate decision to pretend Jimmy Martinez never existed. Sophie was examining another document, this one handwritten on what appeared to be company stationery. When she read it aloud, her clear young voice made the words sound like an indictment. All physical evidence relocated to third-floor storage pending permanent disposal. Family inquiries to be handled through legal department with standard denial protocols. Project timeline remains unchanged. Insurance claims documentation requires additional security review before destruction. The note was signed with initials that made Daniel's world tilt on its axis, VH and RH coordinating. HH approval confirmed. VH, RH, and HH Vanessa Hale, Ryan Hale, and Harold Hale. The family that had owned Cross Development before selling it to Daniel. The family that had somehow managed to bury not just evidence of Jimmy Martinez's death, but the entire existence of Jimmy Martinez himself. The sounds we've been hearing, Daniel said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. They're not someone trying to get out. Sophie nodded with the grim wisdom of someone who had figured this out long before the adults around her. They're the sounds of someone trying to get back in, someone who knows what's hidden here and wants to make sure it stays hidden forever. As if summoned by their discovery, footsteps began echoing from the hallway outside, deliberate, purposeful steps that suggested their midnight investigation had not gone unnoticed. Daniel quickly switched off his flashlight, plunging them into the artificial darkness of their hidden room. Through the opening they'd created, they could see the beam of another flashlight approaching, accompanied by voices that made Daniel's blood freeze in his veins. "I told you this would happen eventually," came Vanessa Hale's voice, tight with barely controlled fury. 25 years we've kept this buried, and now some nosy little girl and her bleeding heart protectors are going to destroy everything our family built. The voices in the hallway grew closer, and Daniel could distinguish two speakers, Vanessa's familiar tone sharp with anxiety and authority, and another voice he didn't recognize but that carried the same inflection and cadence. Family resemblance revealed through stress and shared secrets. The demolition was supposed to happen this morning. The unfamiliar voice replied, male, younger than Vanessa's, but carrying the same undertone of desperation, masked as control. This whole building should be nothing but rubble and dust by now. 25 years of careful planning, and it falls apart because Cross decided to play hero. Daniel gestured for Sophie and Whitaker to remain silent, pulling them deeper into the shadows cast by the overturned filing cabinets. Through the opening they'd hammered in the wall, they could see flashlight beams sweeping the hallway with systematic precision. Well, it's not rubble. Vanessa snapped, her professional composure completely abandoned in favor of raw frustration. And now Daniel is asking questions about 1998 construction records. Do you have any idea how many layers of bureaucracy I had to navigate to bury those files? How many officials had to be convinced to overlook inconsistencies? How many records clerks had to develop selective amnesia? The second voice, which Daniel was beginning to realize belonged to Ryan Hale, the brother Vanessa had mentioned in casual conversation, but who had somehow never appeared at company functions or official meetings, carried a note of genuine remorse that was completely absent from his sister's tone. We should never have hired that off-books crew in the first place, Ryan said quietly. Dad was so desperate to cut costs on the renovation that he was willing to use undocumented workers, no safety inspections, no proper insurance coverage. Cheap labor always comes with expensive consequences. Jimmy Martinez was an accident waiting to happen, Vanessa replied with the kind of cold calculation that made Daniel's skin crawl. Scaffolding fails sometimes. Workers fall. That's the reality of construction work, especially when you're dealing with people who don't understand proper safety protocols. Sophie's hand found Daniel's in the darkness, her small fingers squeezing tight as they listened to adults discuss a human death, as if it were nothing more than an inconvenient business expense. Through the gap in the wall, they could see the edge of Vanessa's flashlight beam as it swept methodically across the area where they'd broken through. But Jimmy Martinez had a family. Ryan protested, his voice carrying genuine anguish. Maria Martinez came here almost every day for months, begging for information about what had happened to her husband. She brought pictures of their children, Daniel, little kids who didn't understand why their father never came home. The Martinez family deserved nothing, Vanessa replied, with a finality that chilled the air around them. Jimmy Martinez was working illegally. No proper documentation, no insurance coverage, no legal right to be on that scaffolding in the first place. Paying them compensation would have been admitting liability for something that was fundamentally their problem, not ours. Daniel felt a surge of rage so intense, it took all his self-control not to burst through the wall and confront them immediately. But Sophie's grip on his hand tightened, reminding him that they needed to hear everything, that documentation and evidence were more important than immediate emotional satisfaction. Besides, Vanessa continued, it worked. Dad was able to complete the renovation project on schedule and under budget. The insurance investigation found no evidence of company negligence because there was no evidence to find. Cross bought the business 2 years later and turned it into something genuinely successful. Everyone won. Everyone except Jimmy Martinez and his family, Ryan said quietly. People who matter, Vanessa clarified with breathtaking callousness. People with legal standing and social connections and the resources to cause real problems if they're not handled properly. The flashlight beams were moving closer to their hiding place, and Daniel could hear Vanessa's heels clicking against the floor with the kind of determined precision that suggested she knew exactly where she was going. The wall has been compromised, Vanessa announced, her voice taking on the authoritative tone Daniel recognized from board meetings and strategic planning sessions. Someone's been here with proper tools. The opening is fresh, probably made within the last few hours. Light from her flashlight began to seep through the gap they'd created, and Daniel realized that discovery was inevitable. But Sophie, with the quick thinking that he was beginning to understand was her greatest strength, had been silently documenting everything with her phone recording, not just their conversation, but the entire sequence of events that had led them to this moment. We need to accelerate the timeline. Vanessa decided, her voice regaining the cold efficiency that Daniel had once admired in his most trusted executive. Everything that's left in that room gets moved tonight. Burned, preferably, though burial might be more secure. And then we expedite the demolition process. I don't care what permits we need to forge, or which city officials require additional financial persuasion. What about Daniel? Ryan asked, and Daniel could hear genuine concern in his voice, not for Daniel's safety, but for the complications his continued involvement might create. Daniel Cross is fundamentally a businessman, Vanessa said, with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd spent considerable time analyzing his character and motivations. He cares about profit margins and development timelines and maintaining positive relationships with city officials. As long as his projects remain profitable and his legal exposure stays minimal, he won't ask difficult questions about ancient history. Sophie looked at Daniel in the artificial darkness of their hiding place, her young face illuminated by the faint glow from her phone screen. In her expression, he saw something that shook him to his core, a look of profound disappointment, as if she were realizing that the adult she'd chosen to trust might ultimately choose convenience over justice. But as Daniel met Sophie's gaze, he felt something fundamental crack and shift inside his chest. Not breaking, but opening like a wall he'd built around his own heart, was finally developing the kind of fractures that let light and air and authentic human connection flow through. He thought about Maria Martinez writing letter after letter to a company that had deliberately erased her husband's existence. He thought about Jimmy Martinez falling from inadequate scaffolding while his family waited for him to return home with his paycheck and his stories about his day. He thought about 25 years of a family living with questions that had answers, with grief that could have been acknowledged, with injustice that could have been addressed. And he thought about the kind of man he had become, someone who could purchase a company without investigating its history, who could trust employees without questioning their ethics, who could build a fortune on a foundation he'd never bothered to examine. But mostly he thought about Sophie, a 10-year-old girl who had noticed what adults chose to ignore, who had cared enough to speak up, despite the potential danger to herself, who had trusted him enough to share her concerns and lead him toward truth. "No," Daniel whispered so quietly that only Sophie could hear him. "Not this time. Not ever again." Sophie's face brightened with something that might have been hope, might have been recognition, might have been the kind of inspiration that comes from watching someone choose to be better than they've ever been before. She held up her phone, showing him that she had captured not just Vanessa and Ryan's conversation, but their entire journey, the discovery of the sealed room, the evidence of the cover-up, the documentation of 25 years of deliberate injustice. Outside their hiding place, Vanessa's flashlight beam was moving systematically closer to the opening they'd created. Her voice carried the kind of cold determination that suggested she was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect the secrets that had allowed her family to escape consequences for Jimmy Martinez's death. "The opening is larger than I expected." Vanessa observed her tone, suggesting she was analyzing the situation like a tactical problem to be solved. "Professional work, not vandalism. Someone with construction experience and proper tools." "What do you want to do?" Ryan asked. "What we should have done 25 years ago," Vanessa replied with chilling finality. "Make sure that anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions understands that some knowledge is dangerous to possess." Sophie looked at Daniel with raised eyebrows, silently asking permission for something that might be their only chance to escape this situation, with their evidence intact and their safety ensured. From her jacket pocket, she pulled what appeared to be a small emergency whistle, the kind parents give children to use if they're ever in serious danger. Daniel nodded, understanding immediately that their window of opportunity was measured in seconds rather than minutes. Sophie put the whistle to her lips and blew with all the force her 10-year-old lungs could generate. The piercing sound echoed through the empty building like a fire alarm, shattering the silence and announcing to anyone within several city blocks that something was very, very wrong at the Meridian building. The sound bounced off concrete walls and empty corridors, amplifying into the kind of urgent distress signal that demanded immediate response. And in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, they could hear the most beautiful sound in the world: sirens. Multiple sirens approaching from different directions, suggesting that Sophie's emergency signal had triggered every safety protocol and emergency response system in the downtown area. What the hell was that? Vanessa's voice carried pure panic, now all pretense of control abandoned. "Emergency whistle," Ryan replied grimly. "Someone called for help." Through the gap in the wall, they could see flashlight beams swinging wildly as Vanessa and Ryan tried to locate the source of the sound, while simultaneously calculating whether they had enough time to destroy evidence before the authorities arrived. "The police will be here in minutes," Vanessa said, her voice tight with the kind of fear that comes from knowing you've been caught doing something unforgivable. "We need to get out of here now." "What about the evidence?" Ryan asked. "Leave it," Vanessa snapped. "We'll deal with the legal consequences later. Right now, we need to be anywhere except here when the police start asking questions about why we're in a condemned building in the middle of the night." But as they prepared to flee, Sophie made another decision that would change everything. She stepped through the opening in the wall, her small figure illuminated by their flashlight beams, and said with the kind of calm authority that only comes from absolute moral certainty, "It's too late to run away. I recorded everything." The sirens belonged to 3 police cars, 2 fire trucks, and an ambulance. Sophie's emergency whistle had triggered every safety protocol in the downtown area. As the first responders flooded into the Meridian building, Vanessa and Ryan found themselves faced with a choice: run and confirm their guilt, or stay and try to explain why they were in a condemned building at 3 in the morning. They chose to run, but Sophie's recording had captured everything: their admission of the cover-up, their threats against her, their plans to destroy evidence and accelerate the demolition. When Officer Patricia Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the downtown precinct, watched the video on Sophie's phone, her expression grew grimmer with each passing second. "This is a recording of active conspiracy to destroy evidence in a workplace fatality," she told Daniel, as paramedics checked Sophie for injuries she didn't have. The statute of limitations on the original incident may have passed, but conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and threats against a minor are all current crimes. Daniel stood in the hallway outside the sealed room, watching as investigators photographed and cataloged the evidence that Vanessa and Ryan had tried so hard to keep hidden. The truth was finally free, but he felt no satisfaction, only a deep, aching regret for how long it had taken to surface. "Mr. Cross." Detective Sarah Chen approached him with a thick folder of documents. "We're going to need to speak with you extensively about your company's records. But I want you to know, based on what we've found here, it's clear that this cover-up predates your ownership. You're not a suspect in the original incident." "But I should have known," Daniel said quietly. "I bought a company without investigating its history. I trusted employees without questioning their motives. I built my success on a foundation that was rotten from the beginning." Sophie appeared at his elbow, her small hand slipping into his larger one. "You couldn't have known," she said with the wisdom that continued to surprise him. "But now you do. That's what matters." "The Martinez family," Daniel said to Detective Chen. "Are they still—" "Maria Martinez remarried and lives in Phoenix now," the detective replied. "Jimmy's son Carlos is a construction supervisor in Denver. His daughter Elena teaches elementary school in San Antonio. They never stopped believing that something had been hidden from them." Daniel felt tears threaten for the first time since his grandmother's funeral 15 years earlier. "I want to contact them. All of them. I want to—" He stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what needed to be done. "One step at a time," Sophie said gently. "That's how you heal big hurts. One step at a time." Over the following weeks, as Vanessa and Ryan Hale were processed through the justice system, Daniel began to understand what true responsibility meant. He hired the best investigative team in the state to uncover every detail of the 1998 incident. He established a victims' compensation fund that went far beyond what any court might have ordered. He implemented new safety protocols and transparency measures that made cross-development a model for ethical construction practices. But perhaps most importantly, he did something that would have been unthinkable to the Daniel Cross, who had first met Sophie on those front steps. He made the Martinez family partners in his business, giving them not just compensation, but ownership in the company that had tried to erase their father and husband from history. The Meridian building was not demolished. Instead, Daniel converted it into the Jimmy Martinez Memorial Community Center, a place where families like Sophie's could access free legal aid, job training, and advocacy services. The third-floor East Wing, where the truth had been hidden for so long, became a library dedicated to workers' rights and workplace safety. But it was the dedication ceremony that truly changed everything for Daniel Cross. Maria Martinez, now 73 and still fierce despite her small stature, stood before the crowd, with Elena and Carlos flanking her on either side. When she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone who had never stopped fighting for truth. "My Jimmy would be proud," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "Not because his name is on a building, but because no other family will have to wonder what happened to someone they love. Because when bad things happen, they will not be hidden behind walls." Daniel had prepared remarks, but when his turn came to speak, he found himself looking at Sophie, who sat in the front row, wearing her best dress and the most serious expression he had ever seen on her young face. "Sometimes," Daniel began, his voice stronger than he'd expected, "the most important lessons come from the smallest teachers. 27 days ago, a little girl told me there was something behind a wall. She was right about that. But what she really taught me was that there was something behind the wall I had built around my own heart." He paused, looking out at the crowd of neighbors, city officials, and Martinez family members who had come to witness this moment. We like to think that successful people are the ones who tear down the most obstacles. But true success, the kind that matters for generations, comes from tearing down the right walls, the ones that hide truth, the ones that separate us from each other, the ones that keep us from seeing that every number in our ledgers represents a human life that matters. Sophie smiled at him from the audience, and Daniel felt something settle in his chest, a warmth he was still learning to trust. The ceremony ended with Elena Martinez cutting the ribbon that opened the center's main doors. But for Daniel, the real moment of redemption came later, when Sophie approached him as the crowd was dispersing. "Mr. Cross," she said formally, then grinned. "I mean, Daniel, I have something for you." She held out a small, wrapped package. Inside was a photograph, one she had clearly taken herself. It showed the wall they had broken down, but from after the truth had been revealed. Sunlight was streaming through the opening they had created, illuminating the evidence scattered on the floor beyond. On the back in Sophie's careful handwriting were the words, "Sometimes walls are meant to be broken. Thank you for listening to the little girl who knocked." Daniel looked at this child who had changed his life so completely, and for the first time in decades, he felt the true meaning of the word family. Not just the bonds of blood, but the connections forged when people choose to protect each other, to fight for truth. Together, to tear down walls that should never have been built in the first place. 6 months later, Daniel Cross was a different man, leading a different company. The transformation hadn't been easy. Several major clients had canceled contracts. When news of the Martinez case became public, shareholders had demanded explanations. He was still learning how to give, and the business media had painted him as either a hero or a fool, depending on their perspective. But when Daniel looked in the mirror each morning, he saw someone he actually liked. Someone his grandmother would have been proud of. The Jimmy Martinez Memorial Community Center had become the heart of the neighborhood. What had once been an aging office building was now alive with children's laughter, adult education classes, and the kind of community gatherings that transform strangers into neighbors. Sophie was a regular volunteer, helping elderly residents navigate computer classes and reading to younger children in the community library. On this particular Saturday morning, Daniel found her in the center's main hall, setting up chairs for what she called Story Circle, a weekly gathering where community members shared experiences that needed to be heard. "We have someone special today," Sophie announced as Daniel approached. "Mrs. Martinez is going to tell us about the day she met Jimmy." Maria Martinez sat in the circle's center chair, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. At 73, she had found something she'd thought was lost forever, the ability to speak her husband's name without pain overwhelming the love. "He was the most motivational person I ever knew." Maria began, her voice strong and clear. "Not because he gave speeches or made big plans, but because he made every person he met feel like they mattered. Like their work mattered. Like their family mattered." Daniel took a seat in the circle as had become his custom. These Saturday mornings had taught him more about leadership than any business school ever could. Jimmy would see a new worker on the construction site, someone scared and young and far from home, and he would take them under his wing, Maria continued. He would say, "Your family sent you here to build something important. Every brick you lay, every beam you secure, it's not just construction, it's hope." A teenager named Marcus, who had been coming to the center's job training program, raised his hand. "Mrs. Martinez, how do you keep believing in people after something so bad happened?" Maria's smile was gentle but fierce. "Because Jimmy taught me that people aren't good or bad. They're just scared or brave. The people who hid the truth about his accident, they were scared. Scared of losing money, scared of facing consequences, scared of admitting they made mistakes." She looked directly at Daniel. "But the people who broke down that wall to find the truth, they chose to be brave, even when it cost them something." Sophie spoke up, her young voice carrying a wisdom that still surprised the adults around her. "My mom says that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're scared, but you do the right thing anyway." "Your mother is a smart woman," Maria said warmly. "And you, little girl, are an inspirational example of what happens when we listen to our hearts instead of our fears." After Story Circle ended, Daniel walked with Sophie to her favorite spot in the center, a window seat in the third-floor library overlooking the street where she had first approached him with news of the wall. The space that had once hidden evidence of a cover-up now displayed photographs of community achievements, children's artwork, and a memorial wall featuring Jimmy Martinez and other workers who had been injured or killed on construction sites across the city. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened to you that day?" Daniel asked. Sophie considered this with characteristic seriousness. "I think the truth would have found another way out," she said finally. "Truth is like water. If you dam it up, it just finds a different path to where it needs to go." Daniel smiled. "That's very wise." "My grandma told me that," Sophie admitted. "She lives in the apartment upstairs from us. She's 91 and she says she's seen enough walls built and torn down to know that the important ones always fall eventually. I'd like to meet your grandmother someday. She'd like that too. She says you remind her of her husband the way he changed after the war. She says some people need something big to shake them awake to who they really are." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood children play in the small park that Cross Development had built where a parking lot used to be. Daniel had learned that some investments couldn't be measured in profit margins. "Daniel," Sophie's voice was thoughtful, "do you think Mrs. Martinez really forgives you?" It was a question that had haunted Daniel for months. "I hope so. But more importantly, I'm learning to forgive myself. Not for what happened to Jimmy, that wasn't my fault, but for taking so long to care about something more than money. My mom says forgiveness isn't about pretending bad things didn't happen. It's about choosing to build something good from the pieces." Daniel looked at this remarkable little girl who had taught him the most important lesson of his life. "Sophie, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "That first day when you told me about the wall, you seemed so certain there was something important hidden there. How did you know?" Sophie's expression grew thoughtful. "I didn't know for sure, but Mr. Whitaker always looked sad when he walked past that part of the building. And sometimes at night, I would hear sounds that didn't match the other building sounds. And..." She paused as if deciding whether to share something important. And my grandma taught me that when grown-ups work really hard to make sure nobody talks about something, that usually means it's something that should be talked about." Daniel laughed, the kind of genuine laughter that had become more frequent in recent months. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise woman." "She is. She also makes really good cookies if you're interested. I would be honored to meet the woman who raised such an extraordinary granddaughter." As the afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, Daniel felt a contentment he had never experienced during his years of pure financial success. The Jimmy Martinez Memorial Community Center would never appear on any profit and loss statement as an asset, but it had given him something no amount of money could buy: the knowledge that his life was making other lives better. And it had all started with a little girl who paid attention, who cared enough to speak up, and who trusted that sometimes adults could choose to do the right thing even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. The story of Daniel Cross, Sophie, and the wall that changed everything is more than just a tale of hidden truth and corporate redemption. It's a reminder that courage comes in all sizes. Wisdom often arrives in the smallest packages, and the most powerful transformations happen when we choose to tear down the barriers that separate us from each other. Maria Martinez was right. Jimmy would have been proud, not just of the building that bears his name, but of the family that chose to honor his memory by ensuring no other family would suffer in silence. Not just of the little girl who insisted on being heard, but of the man who finally learned to listen. In a world where walls seem to grow higher every day, walls of indifference, walls of greed, walls of fear, this story stands as proof that some barriers are meant to be broken. That truth, like Sophie said, will always find a way. And that sometimes the most inspirational thing we can do is simply pay attention to the voices that others choose to ignore. The Meridian Building still stands no longer a monument to buried secrets, but a beacon of hope for anyone who believes that it's never too late to do the right thing. And in its library, there's a small plaque that reads, "Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. Always listen." If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of speaking up for what's right, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the courage to tear down walls and build bridges instead. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters no matter how small they think it is. Because sometimes the truth is just waiting for someone brave enough to say, "It's behind that wall." And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to break it down.